So the first part of a stress cycle is this. A stress cycle occurs when the demands outstrip recovery, where the kid can't come back. He's having trouble coming back. And that's when we see problems, whatever the problems are. It's telling us that I've pushed these recovery mechanisms too far. Now, to complicate the issue is, suppose now, as a result of being pushed too far, the caregiver is annoyed or irritated or angry and responds to these problematic behaviors, not knowing them for what they are. So the caregiver responds by shouting or punishing or ignoring or storming off, leave the kid on its own. And so now what happens is that dyad gets caught in a stress cycle. What's happening to that dyad is, in a stress cycle, the stress just gets more and more and more. The stress is intensifying because of the multiplier effect, because the thresholds have dropped. So the child's getting more and more stressed. The child is not coming back to baseline. Problems are arising, and now we see the same thing happen dyadically. We see that caregiver, whether it's a parent or a teacher or whoever, becoming swept up in this dyadic stress cycle. Okay? And now we've got to help. I'll give you an interesting case of this. I don't know how well I've explained this. So this is a little girl, and I believe it's in the book. I can't keep track anymore. And she was 10 or 11. I've forgotten her name now. We gave her a phony name in the book. And the little girl was having meltdowns every single night, a young teenage girl. And it would start at around bedtime, which was, in this family's case, like 8 o'clock. And the storms would last 2, 3, 4 hours. And eventually, the kid would, and so the child is screaming, the mother is screaming. It's a good mom, a really, really nice mom. And the kid is pretty much insane. Okay, so the kid is, Donald Trump introducing Mike Pence. And eventually, every night, the kid falls asleep. So she falls asleep at, let's say, she falls asleep at 11 o'clock, midnight. So here's your question. Here's your first question. Why does she fall asleep? Right. So that is entropy. Okay, so what's happened is that if you push this system hard enough, it will collapse. It will, but this is unbelievably non-constructive, because you think about the wear and tear on the child, the wear and tear on the mother. You think about how is that kid going to be the next day? That kid has now stripped. She's been running on adrenaline. That's what all the shouting's about. She's in fight or flight, and so she has to wake up the next morning, and she is awful. So she's an awful kid. And by the way, it was a sweet, sweet child. So you're thinking, well, what's going on here? Now, in the meantime, mom is really, really trying. And so she's gonna, and so she told me, in our very first meeting, so I'm asking her, so what do you do when this is happening? And it would happen over like crazy stuff, like the kid making it up. Except kids don't make things up, right? Like that's their reality, that's their, so, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this in the book or not. She was the youngest of 3 children, and because she was the youngest, she had the smallest bedroom. And so the night after night, the trigger would be that her older sister had this, okay, this you can't make up. The older sister had walk-in closets in her bedroom. This kid's got hooks. So she wanted mom, and mom was seriously considering knocking out, they were going to build a whole extension on the outside of the house so that the kid could have a walk-in closet. Okay, so we had to explain to mom that actually the issue here is not the walk-in closet. But you're desperate, right? I mean, there's not a parent here who hasn't been in that situation where, okay, you know, like it's going to cost me $300,000. And how do you explain that, you know, $300,000 later, guess what? You know, we're still having the tantrums, only now it's about she doesn't have floor-length mirrors. But we as language-speaking creatures, we tend to take these things literally. Like, you know, if our kid says that's what it is, that must be what it is. And what was happening is that mom was unbelievably flooded. So this poor mom is going through this every night. She loves her kid. She's a good kid. And mom's at her wit's end. And she has, unfortunately, come to the conclusion that it's a bad kid. It's hard not to. That the kid, she told me, mom tells me, the child is clearly trying to pick fights. She is asserting herself, whatever it is. And so your perceptions of your child, if you go back to what we were talking about with Ellen Langer yesterday, your perceptions of your own child become twisted a little bit, where you see, because, you know, look, you're going to have this threat response to your own kid because the limbic system, right, the limbic system, which is the source of seeing threats, was designed before we became Ainsworth-type children. I'm thinking Tronic. Like it's an ancient system where we didn't really distinguish between my pup and a foreign pup, my child and other ones. That limbic system doesn't differentiate between, you understand what I'm saying here? It does not differentiate between my child and another child who's a threat. A threat is a threat for the limbic system, even if it's my own kid. Then, of course, what happens is when you calm down, you go into unbelievable guilt. I can't believe I said those things. I can't believe I did those things. I can't believe I hit my child. And then what happens is they go into the opposite extreme and they reward the child. And that's a frequent pattern, right? Where you become overly authoritarian and then overly permissive. And that kind of abusive pattern, that chaotic pattern, reinforces the stress cycle that this family is caught in. Okay, so we can go on and on with this. The point is that I have a family now, and you can play this out any way you want. You can play it out in a family, you can play it out between partners, spouses, you can play it out between class or school, or you can play it out in Cleveland. So we have this situation where the limbic system is running the show. And unfortunately, we now know, and I'm going to explain this in 2 seconds, we now know that when the limbic system runs the show, it's not simply the case that the impulses coming from the amygdala or the hippocampus are that much stronger. It's not simply the case that the child's sensitivity to whatever's a stress for that child is that much lower, like that much greater, so they're triggered. It's also the case that those parts of the brain that we need to think, that we need to stop and say, what the hell are we doing here, are offline. So, and we even know which systems they are. We can give them fancy names. So basically what's happening is there is a shift in the brain. They talk about it now. We talk about it as the shift from learning brain to survival brain. But what we're really looking at here is that the very capacities that we need to think about what we're saying, we need to think about our choices, who we're electing, those systems are offline. And I've got to help this mom now.